For joining tonight on the 22nd episode of the Neurosurgery Journey. Thanks for bearing with us as we took a little break over the past couple weeks as we transition into a summer schedule. So I'm really excited to be joined by one of my personal research mentors, Dr. Rich Menger. Dr. Menger is an assistant professor of neurosurgery at the University of South Alabama. He serves there as the founding director of the South Alabama Spine Health Institute. Dr. Menger completed his undergraduate studies at Cornell. He then went on to earn his medical degree from Georgetown University. He did his neurosurgery residency at Louisiana State University, including a enfolded fellowship in adult and pediatric spine surgery. He then did a prestigious fellowship in complex spine surgery at Columbia University before joining the faculty at University of South Alabama. Dr. Menger's clinical and research interests are focused on optimizing the delivery of spine care. And in addition, because that doesn't keep him busy enough, he also has an appointment in political science and has an interest in the policy, business, and economics of neurosurgery, which is kind of what we titled this, this talk today, or this session today. We're going to talk a little bit more generally just about Dr. Menger's career and how he fits in, those sort of niche interests with that. So, Dr. Menger, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and certainly a warm introduction. So I really appreciate that. Look forward to the opportunity to speak to everyone tonight. So thanks again for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for anybody logged on the net, feel free to put questions or comments in the chat, and we'll get to those. But just to kick off with, first kind of general question that we usually start with is, where did you, or how did you start your journey into neurosurgery? What kind of drew you into the field?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of what I sort of mentor our medical students and my approach to is just, I think first when you're, a first year medical student or applying to medical school, or in the early part of the process is, kind of putting yourself into one of three towers, right? So it's sort of like the medicine pediatric side is more sort of thinking, right? And then the surgeon side is kind of like the doing side, right? Obviously, it's a big generalization, right? But sort of, think you're doer, and then that third tree is maybe something a little bit more esoteric, like, radiation oncology, radiology, maybe doesn't fit into those baskets as much, but it's sort of, you're a thinker or doer type person. And I kind of fell into the, action item plan of taking care of sort of by action. And then, that kind of put me in that surgical procedural direction. And then I actually thought I was going to initially be a trauma surgeon. I did research in between my first and second year of med school, with trauma surgery department. One of my first papers is on resuscitation and trauma data and chest tubes. So that's the direction I thought I was going to go, and I just sort of really found myself getting pulled towards the neurosurgery direction and taking care of individuals who have neurosurgery problems, which I really first kind of got introduced to during some of that trauma experience that I was talking about.
Awesome. So you knew you were a doer, and you were kind of trying to figure out how or what you wanted to do, more or less. And obviously there's trauma in neurosurgery, so that kind of makes sense that there was that overlap that you saw. So we talked about how your particular subspecialty interest is in spine surgery. So what kind of drew you into that and pursuing the two fellowships in spine?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's the same evolution of going into neurosurgery, then subspecializing into it, which is, what I observed and talking to mentors and just sort of thinking about stuff is, I think if you really find yourself drawn to something independent of any of the ancillary parts of it, you're going to be really motivated to push that field, read about those things, do those things. And I think that, I tried to kind of go back to your earlier question a little bit, is I tried not to like neurosurgery, right? Just because of the tenacity of everything related to it. And I tried, ophthalmology, I tried neuroradiology, tried neurology, right? All rotations in medical school. And I just found myself wanting to be in neurosurgery, kept, looking at the board to see what neurosurgery cases were going and things like that. So that was the pull. And same thing in residency, where There's obviously a very large breadth of neurosurgery. I think that's a really cool part of the specialty is that, if you subspecialize in an academic center, you can have radically different practice, right? And I really liked the spinal deformity and pediatric spinal deformity for just the impact that can have on people's lives. The secondary is obviously the technical nature of surgery is very demanding and very interesting to me. And the third is, it's very tangibly immediately rewarding in the sense that the patient has an x-ray that looks, like a pre-op x-ray, and then you have a post-op x-ray. So it's a very tangible sort of, kind of stamp on what you were able to do in the operating room. So I think kind of putting all those things together is kind of what pushed me towards spinal deformity and pediatric spinal deformity, especially.
Awesome. Yeah. And maybe for, we have some students that log on that are early in medical school or even high school or undergrads. So can you tell us a little bit about what does spinal deformity encompass? What kind of patients, do you see on a regular basis? To be honest, all I know is when people talk about spinal deformity, they're like, yeah, these are big surgeries.
Yeah.
They think of going from like cervical to pelvis, is kind of the joke, right?
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a great question. I'll kind of give a little overview, for people who are kind of entering into this world for the first time. So I think, the idea is that, spinal deformity is a heterogeneous term. So it's something that encompasses a lot of different, diseases and a lot of different diagnoses and so on. And I think when we think about spinal deformity, right, I think it's like that. Yeah, sure. That's a big surgery, most of the time, right? And what that means is that there's some sort of anatomical deviation to the spine's normal alignment. So it's supposed to have a certain amount of front and back sway and a certain alignment of your head over your pelvis and so on. And there's obviously a lot of granularity to that. And when it doesn't behave like that, there's a lot of things that go wrong in our body, from pain standing to, in severe cases, heart and lung functioning that stops, right? So, or at least gets severely diminished. So the spinal deformity is something to think that the sort of suspension bridge of anatomy that holds our spinal cord from our brain down to the rest of the body isn't in the right shape, and that causes a whole host of neurological and potentially body, and then of course posture related problems that we seek to intervene in both kids and adults for different reasons and different diagnoses to help them sort of have a more anatomical or quote unquote normal alignment.
Awesome. Thank you for that overview. So when you got to University of South Alabama, you kind of brought about this Spine Institute, where you had this idea of sort of optimizing, or we could say revolutionizing or changing spinal care. So what is kind of your philosophy on spinal care, and what are you trying to do with the Spine Institute?
So great. Yeah, great question. So I think the traditional model that existed previously was very siloed, right? In the sense that, you'd have somebody who, had a certain diagnosis and they'd be treated a certain way. And then if it needed a surgical evaluation, it would be sent to the surgeon, right? So again, if we're going to take a very sort of general diagnosis with kind of our audience here, is like, if you had back pain, well, oh, he had back pain, and I told my regular doctor, and then they got an MRI, and maybe they saw something, and I'll send them to the surgeon, and then the surgeon will give me feedback, and we'll see what we kind of do from there. And that's sort of that old split siloed model. And I think, if you look at some of the leading places, or you just sort of stop and look at a 20,000 foot view of what we do, I think linking in all the experts within the sort of vertical delivery of that care is a kind of a more thoughtful approach to tackling this. So what I mean by that is, if you have back pain, right, it's not just, you see the surgeon, you see a surgeon for surgery, but the back pain diagnosis has a whole host of people that, if they're talking together, working together, aligned together, can provide a better experience, potentially better outcome, right? So the idea of, you have back pain, you see your primary care doctor, then you enter into sort of this maybe more holistic approach, and you can get physical therapy, injections, weight loss consultation, smoking cessation consultation, sometimes even psychological evaluations and help with that, because it could be really, really challenging for patients who have chronic pain like this, and again working with pain management too. So kind of everybody branding and working together rather than just sort of working in separate silos to help kind of deliver a more complete care package. And I think that's sort of like part one. And then part two is these spinal deformity surgeries are like you said, for lack of a medical word, big, and it requires a lot of people for you to have a successful outcome, right? It's not just some surgeon that thinks they're awesome and can do a big surgery and get an x-ray to look a certain way. You have to get that patient better, get them through that whole process. So if you have an integrated care and a lot of people working together for the same goal, can help that outcome a lot.
Awesome. Yeah. So it sounds like a very patient-centered, holistic approach they're trying to take, treating the patient and not the imaging, in a way. We actually just had about a month ago a talk from the Mayfield Clinic, and they shared, their model, which sounds pretty similar in that they incorporate a lot of the primary care and physical therapy and things like that into their practice. So hopefully our audience is somewhat familiar with that. Kind of to link this, with your interest in policy and business and economics, something that Mayfield talked a lot about was the challenge of, practicing medicine, which is something, we all love, but doing it in the healthcare system, which can be extremely challenging. So what drove your interest in health policy and socioeconomics?
Sure, great question. So, I think so. My major in college was biology and society, which is Cornell's version essentially of biology for medical school, and then understanding the societal impact of that. So that was sort of my first sort of taste into the policy kind of world and socioeconomic world around healthcare. Right? So that sort of maybe at least lit the fire a little bit or opened my eyes a little bit to some of the complexity that happens outside of just kind of being a doctor, right, and delivering care. And then in residency at LSU at the time, it was a 2 published papers per year requirement. It was a robust research enterprise. And, as a junior resident, you're sort of, trying to learn the ropes and obviously learn neurosurgery, to also learn how to do research. And I just found myself, again, asking those type of questions a little bit more. So again, that same kind of advice and maybe drive home point is, if you follow kind of what you want to do and have a natural interest in that, it'll help you sort of want to push that and want to do those things. And then, and I haven't really talked much about this, but there's a course called the RUN course, RUNN, that is put on by Organized Neurosurgery that kind of helps you introduce you to some of the top researchers in the country doing all sorts of things for neurosurgery and outside neurosurgery too. You kind of go for a week or so, it might be a little shorter than that, and you hear all these talks. And one of the giants in our field, Dr. Friedlander, sort of left a question for everybody at the end of his talk that was like, how are you going to change neurosurgery? How are you going to make it different? What are you going to do that will make neurosurgery different, right? And that question stuck with me for a long time. And the way that I saw myself doing that was through the socioeconomic side of what we do, right? So, and so I pushed that, and for those of you that aren't fully aware, one of the structures of neurosurgery residency is that there's a year out of the operating room, or at least out of the operating room rotations. So there's a lot of freedom depending on what residency and support you have to do certain things, right? So you can work in a lab, right? You can do more infiltrated training sometimes, or you can kind of step out and do different things. And I had a tremendously supportive, program director, chair, faculty at LSU, and supportive residents. And I was able to go get a degree to kind of, again, further that mission of sort of maybe understanding this stuff better and kind of, again, mingling and working with people that understand policy a little bit. So I think that's where I really kind of learned a lot more and implemented a lot more tools to make, kind of, more impactful changes. So I think that's sort of my evolution through kind of being involved in that, and that's sort of my continued push here now.
Sure, yeah. And that's a really unique niche. I mean, I think you can probably count, on one hand, the number of neurosurgeons that are really engaged as, what we might call like a policy wonk. Um, and you're certainly among them. Um, so, a couple of points just to follow up on that. So you mentioned the structure of the residency program and that you had that support at LSU. This was a specific interest that came after you had been at residency. But was there a perspective that you had on going into residency and looking for somewhere that had that flexibility or that offered that, protected research time?
Yes, I think that's a really great question for people that are kind of coming up through the process. So, that's definitely something that, not knowing necessarily where you want to land completely is not a quote unquote bad thing at all, right? But if you have an idea or the type of structure you want, the type of program that you want, asking those questions and researching that is a really, really smart approach, right? And some of that's on the website, some of it's by word of mouth and just talking to people, and some of it you can ask that question in a assertive, respectful way on the interview, cycle trail to make sure that you're the right fit. Because I can promise you that the program's also want someone who's a right fit for them too, right? It's definitely a mutual thing, and I think my approach to a little bit of a tangent, but my approach when I was looking at residencies is I sat back and I said, okay, there's a couple different types of residencies, and there's heavy academic, less case volume residencies. So I did an away rotation at a program like that traditionally, again, I did 3 away rotations. I did one at a place that's more academic, that traditionally a little bit less case volume. I did another one at a place that is extremely high case volume, but traditionally less, academic, kind of brick and mortar productivity. And then the other I did a little bit of a different care model that is a little bit different than most hospital systems. So I tried those systems out to get an idea of the type of experience that I was seeking. So I think being thoughtful and strategic about how you approach residencies, which you're sort of hinting at, is really good. But I think the first step of that is taking some time to make sure that what you're looking for. I think that's also a super important part of that, right? And making sure that you're making the right choice for you, because it may be A++ program for most people or everybody, but if it's not for you, then that's not going to be a good fit for either direction. So I think that's a kind of a really important part of that process too.
Yeah, right. I always hear the analogy that when you're applying to residency, it's kind of like you're getting married, and for some, that's going to be longer than a marriage, unfortunately. So definitely some sage advice there to get to know yourself before going into it. So you mentioned that you went and you did graduate studies and you earned a master's of public administration. And just to highlight that a little bit more, you earned that from the Harvard Kennedy School, which might not sound all that impressive. Of course, it has the name of Harvard, but I don't think people realize Harvard Kennedy School, the alumni that come out of there go on to be top politicians and policy leaders. So you were immersed with some of the top policy thinkers in the United States. What drove you, to specifically say, like, I want to do the MPA, I want to do it at the Kennedy School, and how would that compare with, let's say, an MPH or an MBA?
Great, yeah, great question. So so I looked at a couple different programs when I was putting all that stuff together and thinking about what I wanted to do, and I looked at the MBA and MPH programs, and I actually looked at a couple of MS programs that were in some specific, really dense, policy type space. And then, a journey to the Kennedy School was exactly what you kind of hinted at, where, in a class of 200-ish people, right, there were 2 doctors, right? So it was incredible to learn from, or excuse me, 3 doctors, but it was incredible to learn from all the people who were outside that world doing so many different things, and people who are currently ambassadors for their country, people who are running for Congress, people who are managing nonprofits, people who are in the traditional consulting profit type world too. So learning from all those people and their experience was really what I valued, and saying, is there a different approach for that, right? And I think one of the take home points that took me a little bit by surprise, but like sort of literally day one, day two, day three was, we are so hyper focused on neurosurgery as is required to succeed in that complexity. But when you take a step back, it is a small part of what everybody's considering when they put healthcare together. So I think having that lens and working with those people was a really important, part of that decision when I was kind of getting down to exactly what I was going to do for that year. And then what drew me specifically to Harvard was the opportunity, the courses, the types of classes they had, the ability to take different classes across all the different schools, of Harvard. And again, just sort of, just a great opportunity to kind of, again, help change or push neurosurgery. So that's what sort of pushed me to that program.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think for a lot of people in medicine, you don't realize how important the people that you're with in a cohort are, because we're so used to just being hyper focused on, you study the book and then you test it. Whereas when you get into a graduate school, I've even seen this in my own PhD experience. Your cohort are really the ones that you're learning a lot from, because you're sitting and you're doing things like journal clubs, or a lot of it is group-based work. So it definitely makes sense that you were looking for that opportunity at the Harvard program.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback on that a little bit, which is, if you have a really, desire for a business mind, and you want to tackle something in business and you want to get really good at that, right, then that MBA is the right calling for you, right? If you're like, I want to design major studies and change the way we do A, B, C, or D, and I want to learn that better. I'm not as good at designing RCTs as I'd like to be, right? Or whatever that looks like, then that's your focus, right? Every kind of lane has its way to be the expert person, right? And I think, if you mentioned the PhD space, right, your mentor of who is there, that is like the most critical part, that any institutional name or geographic location or whatever it may be. It's like, if you want to partner with that person to push that field, that's the connection you're trying to make. So there's no cookbook for doing that. It's what's best for you based on what you want to create out of your career.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we could, hit a little bit more, if you can step back into those shoes, what were you thinking of, like, how the MPA or, just the interest in policy would kind of drive neurosurgery forward, and then maybe more broadly, driving health policy and economics forward?
Yeah, so I think I realized just from reading in osmosis that, a lot of people that make the rules about what we do and don't do aren't neurosurgeons, right? A lot of people that make the rules about what we do and don't do aren't necessarily even physicians, right? So if you can understand that lane and understand why they're making decisions that they make, because they have to make some really difficult decisions, but why they're making decisions that they make can help us sort of be able to provide the right kind of, care that we want to be able to provide for our patients, right? You have to be at the conversation table and understand what they're talking about, and be able to converse, to be able to help, have some ability to impact the change that you're trying to make. So I think that's where I saw myself pushing that and sort of integrating that skill set.
Yeah, that makes sense. And not to mention, you did write the book on, business and policy and economics in neurosurgery, which you graciously sent to me, and I have a copy right here.
Thank you. Yeah, I was one of the editors. A lot of great authors in that book, and
Absolutely.
a lot of authors who aren't in neurosurgery, right? To that effect, right? So same concept, to bring some of those things that we maybe don't traditionally see into our sort of purview.
Yeah. Did you bring anybody in as an author that you had met through the Kennedy School?
Yes, yeah. There's definitely authors in there from that. Yep.
Sweet, cool. So it shows, the strength of those relationships to bring them in on your academic work. Just a thought question, and I'm sure if you ask 1,000 people, you get 1,000 different questions. But what do you think is the one of the biggest challenges facing healthcare, or even neurosurgery more specifically from a policy standpoint?
Yeah, so I think the most immediate pragmatic challenge that is relatively significant is the amount of mergers and acquisitions in the healthcare space, and the growing employment of neurosurgeons in the sense that there's less people in traditional private practices. It's ceding a tremendous amount of control to a very finite amount of hospitals, and their lobbying power far exceeds that of the physician cohort. So they've been able to implement very favorable sort of um, terms, so to speak, in how this legislation sort of pans out. I think that is a very significant issue in the sort of near term that we're living through, that all neurosurgeons see almost on a daily basis. And then I think long term is just the fiscal solvency of what we do is going to be challenged, right? And I think that there's a lot of black and white data about that where um, something will change at some period of time for someone and a group of people. So I think that that's definitely on the horizon where we're not going to be able to fund in what we are doing long term. So,
Yeah, I remember reading through some of the Medicare Trust Fund report from I think 2022. And writing up our Medicaid paper,
yeah,
and yeah, it was pretty scary. So definitely some big stuff on the horizon that's going
yeah,
to need to be handled. All right, so to transition topics a little bit. So we said you're a neurosurgeon, a clinical research in spine surgery. You have an MPA, and you do political science and policy research. And on top of all that, you also serve in the Navy Reserve. Are you a lieutenant commander or commander now?
commander now. Yeah, yeah,
Awesome. All right, so '05, getting up in
yeah.
the ranks there. Very nice. So where did the military service come in, on your neurosurgery journey, and what kind of drew you to that?
Yeah, so I always felt called to have that be part of my experience, and have benefited a lot from a lot of the opportunities that our country has. So a way to sort of give back and push that. And I think when I was looking at how to do that as a neurosurgeon, the reserve practice model best fit that. It's a fairly kind of long discussion, and there's a lot of different opportunities to serve and a lot of different ways to do that. But for me and my family and my life, and the different things I wanted to do, that the reserve opportunity was the correct sort of fit for me. So that's something I knew I wanted to do. There's a specific program in the Navy that you can approach the Navy after you match or you're a resident, in the sense that you're going to come to them, as a trained neurosurgeon or in the neurosurgery training pipeline or as an ER doctor or so on. And that's radically different than, maybe taking a medical school scholarship, right? And there's different pros and cons to that approach. But for me, that was the right cadence of sort of approaching that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, when I was going through the process of thinking and joining the service as well, talking to people was super helpful. So actually, I had the chance to talk to one of your colleagues, Dr. Gavin Dunn, about,
Yep.
what it would look like to be a reservist neurosurgeon. And there's also some pretty, decent literature that just talks about the options. And I think you authored one of those, talking about the different approaches to serving in the military, which is super cool, and definitely encourage folks to check that out if that's an interest of theirs. So if I recall right, you were mobilized during COVID.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. What did that look like? What were you doing? And
Yes, a little bit. Obviously, never anything I ever thought we would see in our lifetime, type of event. And it was something where received a call on a Friday for a deployment on a Sunday, and there was a group that mobilized for different missions for COVID-19 care through all three services. Speaking to my experience, the Navy was present in New York in three ways. One was on the hospital ship. The other was setting up essentially a field type hospital at the Javits Convention Center. And the third was integrating and deploying into these sort of hyper-focused teams into the civilian hospitals that were overrun, and sort of, again, all COVID care. So even as a neurosurgeon, running a COVID ICU for sort of sick COVID patients at Bellevue Hospital with a team of us pushing that forward. So that's sort of what that looked like for it was about 84 days that we were total deployed for that, or mobilized, I should say, for that. So that's been my main neurosurgery, main Navy mobilization experience. So.
Gotcha. And for folks that are out there that are maybe thinking about wanting to join, contemplating active duty or reserve duty, or even the Guard, what does the commitment of a reservist neurosurgeon look like? How long are you expected to be in the service, and what is the, obviously it's not day to day, but I guess weekend to weekend kind of look like for
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so it depends how if you're an active duty neurosurgeon. Active duty means you're full time, right? So you are full time full time military job, and your job as a neurosurgeon. And there's a lot of other things you may do that are collateral duties and so on. But that's a kind of full time job. The reserve is on paper traditionally it's 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. There's different iterations of what that looks like, but it generally actually doesn't always look like that. But the idea, I think, if you were to take kind of like the standard brick and mortar approach of what that would look like, is that kind of 1 weekend a month you go to a local drill facility near where you lived, and you'd maintain your Navy mobilization requirements, do physical fitness tests, and help out with physicals for sailors that may need different things. And then for 2 weeks a year, you'd go to a Navy hospital. Navy neurosurgery at places like San Diego or Bethesda or Portsmouth. And you would, help the active duty cadre, during that time period. There's radically different ways that they can change, and different things you can do, and different leadership tracks you can take. So you can be on more of a medical executive track, where you're maybe not as doing so much neurosurgery, but you're helping manage a clinic and so on. That's obviously an escalation of responsibility. And then you can take an operational track, which is that maybe you do little or almost no neurosurgery. You're attached to an operational unit. And by that, if you're not familiar with that, what that means is that you're with generally either a battalion size or sometimes regiment size. So, 600, 1,000 people, 1,200 people, something along those lines. At the regimental side, you're helping their medical needs and their medical planning, and helping the members of that unit stay sort of medically capable for deployment, and helping them through any issues they may have, or if they do sort of operational exercises like field exercises or things like that for Marine Corps units or CB units. You can be the physician for that. And those schedules aren't so much a 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. They're a little bit more fluid. When the battalion's doing something that needs medical care, you're present and available for that. When they're in the field, you're in the field. So that's the kind of the in my opinion, really the unique opportunities, leadership, sort of learning things outside neurosurgery that the Navy can really offer. So that's kind of a nutshell of the different opportunities that there's a lot of deviation to that, but that's sort of the kind of cool opportunities that may be there, different things, at least from being in a the traditional hospital all the time. So.
Definitely. And for anybody that's more interested in that, I'll definitely plug the War Docs podcast. It's been out, I think, for about a year, maybe a little longer than a year now. And they're really, really good about including a lot of different perspectives on just military medicine. And every time I hear someone, I'm like, wow, I want to do their job. It sounds fascinating. So you hear about all the different things the military can bring to your life. So now, getting a little bit more as we wrap up into the advice section of this. So we're in a way kind of at the start of the application cycle for this year. Folks are getting ready to go out on sub-Is, or maybe already out on their sub-Is. So looking back when you were starting, what was your approach for kind of starting a sub-I, integrating with a new community, getting to know the place, things like that?
Yeah, so starting a sub-I, right? I think, it sounds silly, but it is unbelievably true, and it is true as a junior attending, it's true as a mid-level attending, and it's true as a senior attending. But if it's available, affable, and capable, right? So it is. You want to go there. You want to be yourself, and you want to come in there. You're there. You have uprooted your life to go to a certain geographic location, right? Your focus, your mission, your entire attack is how can I maximize my experience and exposure here, right? So go there, be a good person, be a good team player, right? Pay attention to the cadence of what they're kind of doing, right? If something's painful for the junior resident, see if you can make that less painful, right? That's a little bit different at each place, right? And you can ask questions like, hey, is this helpful, is this annoying, you want me to do this, you want me to do that, and just sort of integrate into the team where you're just part of that team. You're showing up, you're if it's 6 a.m. rounds, you're there at 5:50, right? If it's 4:30, 5:50 with all the information you need, right? If you had to get there at 3:30 to do that, you got to get there at 3:30 to do that, right? That's your window to put out for that, right? And I think that it is not the person who nails an esoteric piece of information that they pulled out, on rounds, right? It's the person that shows up, who's a good person, who works hard, doesn't create any drama, and does the right thing at the right time because it's the right thing to do, and integrates with the team, that I think really kind of stands out, right? It's that person that, sort of has the grit and resiliency to get through the different aspects of neurosurgery. So I think I'll put much more emphasis on thought on that than trying to memorize stuff, right? But the same token of what I'm saying is that if you get asked a question and maybe you don't know it, or someone asks you to look something up, that kind of falls into the category one where you're going to go home or you're going to stay there and read that and know that. So the next time you're on it, right, they'll notice that, they'll pick up on that. Again, a little bit more of grit and resiliency than just sort of being able to pull information out. So.
Yeah, definitely. And I think people find that really challenging because it's a skill that's hard to learn. It's, a lot of times ingrained in you, maybe based on, past experiences. Is there anything, maybe even on your rotations during medical school that you did to build that attitude or, to build that resilience and grit?
I think it's hard. I think I think that's definitely the right way to kind of categorize that. It can be difficult, especially when you're a medical student without a reputation, right? In the sense that you don't know who you actually are. You're not the, if you've been a medical student's been hanging around the department for 3 years and now you're doing your rotation, everyone's like, oh yeah, this guy's great. He wrote this case report, or he helped us with this, or he did this, or he's at conference in the back corner every day, or whatever, right? Like, and you're on the service now. That's different than like, I have no idea who this person is, and they're from this other school, and you make a couple mistakes early. It's easy to get down on that, right? But I promise you, there is not a single person that has made their way through neurosurgery residence house and had difficulty, challenges, things they wish they could have done better, things they could have wished they would have done differently, right? So understanding that no matter what sort of temperature is going on or facade is going on or whatever it may be, is that everybody's kind of been in those shoes before, and I think people just want to work with good people, right? So I think giving yourself some slack if you give yourself a hard time. It's not so much making a mistake, it's what you do when you make it. I think that's the kind of like approach I would take, and that's part of a resiliency approach to failure, right? Is like, oh, that happened, that's not good, okay, how can I mitigate that from happening again, and how can I learn from that? All right, great, awesome, I'm better today than I was yesterday because I learned from that mistake. All right, let's go. Not getting down on like, oh no, I should have been perfect, man, they're going to pick this other person because they knew the Cobb angle measurement for Sherman's kyphosis. No, it's about pushing things forward, each day. So I think that's kind of the approach I would take.
Sure. Not to rag on any one person or situation, but as somebody who, has probably evaluated sub-Is, during residency or fellowship, any kind of oh-no-nos that, you would caution people away
Yeah,
from?
I think, and I'm biased, so I got one person's opinion on this, but
Yeah.
I think if one is any sort of dishonesty is not going to go over well, right? We as the attending, the chief resident, the mid-level resident is trusting that person, right? oh, did you look at the sodium? Yeah, it's good. That, and it's not, and you haven't looked at it, right? And you're thinking, oh, maybe I'll get away with it because it was good yesterday. Yeah, that is catastrophic, right? And that'll result in someone getting hurt, right? So I think that is absolutely catastrophic. And again, more of a character situation. I think that if for most people who are interacting, I think it's having the drive, ambition, and the humbleness to kind of show up, right? I think if you're really, really difficult to get along with, you are not a team player in the sense of helping everybody out and always talking about different things that maybe only pertain to you, or again just not being part of the team. That really sticks out, and people pick up on those little things. So I think when we're evaluating sub-Is, the first thing we do is we ask the people who are very junior, right? So that we get a real sense of how they're interacting at 2 a.m. when they're tired, right? Or how they're interacting when there's a lot of work to be done, or that sort of approach. So I think that's some advice I would give, is that just be a good team player, and be a good person, right? I think it's that goes such a long way with what we do, and what we do a long way in your career too.
Yeah, and I love that you hit on the integrity and not lying, even if it seems like a really small thing at the beginning. And that was something I remember one of the neurosurgery podcasts that Dr. Wayne does down in Miami. He spent an entire episode talking about why integrity is so important, and yeah, it really hits home when you hear about what happens when you don't have that integrity to the patient. So really good first point.
And I think to hit on that too a little bit further, like when you're putting your application together, right? I think your application's a story, right? It's your story, right? It's like, well, I'm this, right? I'm gonna need there. Obviously, Michael, man, and you're like crushing it, right? Like winning awards as like a medical student, your MD, PhD, like, right? So yeah, like your track, like you're like locked in, right? Like people know that you're going to be like an academic guy who's pushing this stuff, right? If that's not your journey, and if you're not going to do that, and you have like one case report, don't anchor on that because you think that's what they want to hear. That is not going to work, right? That approach for that is like, hey, look, I'm from Mississippi, I'm from Ohio, I'm from wherever. I want to be close to my family. I want to go back. I want to serve my community, be the best, neurosurgeon I can be. I'm not sure of my subspecialty yet. I'm here to learn, here to work hard, right? And I just really want to do a good job of serving my community the right way. I'm really open to all the different aspects of neurosurgery. Right. Well, okay. All right, great. Let's have a conversation about that, right? If that's not your actual story, and you're not selling, your where you want to be, I think it's not a recipe for success for anybody. So I think that kind of falls into that other thing, the other first part we were talking about there in your application too.
Absolutely. Yeah, great points. Well, we're getting to the end of our time here, so definitely want to open up if anybody has questions on the net. And one of the favorite questions that I have to ask kind of at the end of the session is if you could go back and talk to Rich Menger, undergraduate or medical student, just getting embarked on the surgery journey and the neurosurgery journey, what advice would you give to that person?
Yeah, so I would give advice to that person to enjoy each stage of the process that you're at, right? I think, as a medical student, you're thinking about internship. As an internship, you're thinking about internship residency. When your residency, are you need your fellowship, and fellowship junior attending, and so on, right? That cadence is like always there, right? Like there's always a next step, right? And I think there's a lot of joy to be had in each step of the process if you let yourself, right? Like, and I think that's a really important part of that is sort of, enjoy each step of the process that you're in, and maximize, that, rather than kind of keep sort of, worrying about what maybe the next step is. So.
Awesome. We do have a question here, if you got a sec for it, from Garrett, who is one of our frequent listeners. So thanks for the question. So he asks, how does healthcare policy research deepen beyond elucidating disparities to proposing solutions which work to fix them? How do you test if a solution works versus just sounds good on paper? And go Jags.
Yeah, so appreciate it, Garrett. Garrett's um, uh, pretty close with our department. Is actually doing some research with our department too. So, um, so obviously that's a very, very complex, difficult question, right? Especially if you're measuring things in a disparate time frame with multiple factorial issues that can come together, right? So I to not be able to answer your question correctly, right? And what I mean by that is there's different models that look at these things or different statistical ways that can be set up to, again, look and see. It's challenging to look at causation, right, in a black and white spectrum. It's very, very difficult to do that, right? I think if you're interested in seeing, that sort of, more tangible approach, right? Health Affairs, they have a blog and then they have a, um, or robust peer-reviewed journal, right? Those are the ways that people are putting these studies together, right? So and I think that whether or not something quote unquote sounds good, I think it's what you're sort of hinting at is maybe judging something by its outcome, not its intention. And I think that is an extremely important part of honestly neurosurgery, but also any sort of health policy changes is being realistic with what the actual outcome is. So there's definitely different models and ways to do that, and data sets to be able to look at that type of thing, and statistical modeling to help kind of pull that out. But it is definitely challenging, and definitely something that is important in actually looking at the different uh, kind of solutions that come out.
Yeah, definitely a great question. One paper that I think is always interesting, and it's a classic, is the Oregon Medicaid program. It's
Yeah,
really a good example of a policy research project that
yeah,
went in, with great intentions, right, to expand Medicaid within that population or expand access theoretically, and didn't necessarily have the results that they would hope to see.
yeah. So I think that's a really, really, really great kind of point to draw on as we close up. So there's read like a couple really sentinel studies that come out of health policy, right? One is looking at the Rand Corporation study, and then the Oregon study, right? And essentially the Oregon study, right, looked at Medicaid expansion and looked at certain, health-related outcomes from patients who have Medicaid versus no insurance, right? And that statistical difference is not really there, right? There's tremendous subgroup analysis related to that, right? And there's different ways that people unpack that, and it's comparing, Medicaid to no insurance, and if you look at that, right, people who have a bias of what they think that should look like, right? Try to find ways to help manipulate the outcome of that study to fit their lens, right? So to go back to Garrett's question a little bit is the other part of this sort of, it's always churning in the background is the political part of this, right? And, you can kind of take this stuff, you can take those findings, which is a black and white peer reviewed paper, and then you can take it and spin it a certain way to fit your specific ideological approach for how that goes. And you can go Google that and look at that, right? And it's there, like absolutely, right? So that's another thing that makes this a little bit difficult in terms of just finding solutions and making sure that they work. So yeah, I think that's a great example, Michael.
For sure. Well, I think that's a great way to end this. Talking about the policy and business and economics of neurosurgery through the lens of your journey, really leading the way on it. So thanks for taking the time to join us tonight.
So, yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and best of luck to everybody. And I hope to see everyone at national meetings. Say hello, and I'll be at the next neurosurgery one is in Washington D.C. coming up for CNS. So if you're there, I'll be there. So say hello.
All right, folks, take care. Have a good night and a good weekend.